Marcus Johnson's weathered hands gripped the mop handle, his movements deliberate and practiced. Through the gleaming glass walls of the CEO's office, he could see Richard Anderson gesturing animatedly during yet another executive meeting. 20 years ago, those same hands had signed the founding documents of Innovatech. Though no one in this room knew that truth. "Hey, janitor. We need a cleanup in conference room B," a young executive barked, not bothering to look Marcus in the eye. "Coffee spill." "Right away, sir." Marcus replied softly, his dignified bearing hidden beneath the blue uniform that had become his disguise. As he pushed his cart toward the conference room, he caught fragments of conversation from Anderson's meeting. "Our image needs updating. Silicon Valley is evolving, and frankly, our workforce demographics are problematic," Anderson was saying. "We need to appeal to a certain caliber of client." Marcus's jaw tightened. He knew exactly what Anderson meant by certain caliber. He'd heard variations of this coded language for 2 decades. The coffee spill in conference room B gave him perfect access to plant another one of his microscopic monitoring devices. At 60, Marcus had mastered the art of invisibility. While everyone saw a janitor, they failed to notice his careful observations, his strategic placement of surveillance equipment, or the fact that he held more computing patents than anyone else in the building. Flashback to 1999, Marcus sat across from venture capitalist Thomas Whitney, watching hope drain from his 10th pitch meeting that month. "Your technology is impressive, Mr. Johnson," Whitney had said, "but our investors might feel more comfortable with a different face representing the company." That night, Marcus made the decision that would shape the next 20 years. He brought in William Anderson, Richard's father, as the white face of Innovatech, while Marcus officially became a maintenance consultant. It was supposed to be temporary. Back in the present, Janet Chen from HR caught his eye as he passed her office. She was one of 2 people who knew his true identity. "Marcus," she whispered, closing her door. "Anderson's planning something big. They are reviewing personnel files of all minority employees." Janet had discovered Marcus's secret 5 years ago when she found discrepancies in the company's founding documents. Instead of exposing him, she became his ally, horrified by the growing discrimination under Richard Anderson's leadership. "How many?" Marcus asked, his voice carrying the weight of responsibility. "At least 30% of the technical staff. They are calling it restructuring for market optimization." Marcus nodded, adding this information to his mental database. His other ally, Michael Thompson, the head of security, would help him access the relevant documents later. Michael, a former FBI agent, had figured out Marcus's identity through his own investigation and had chosen to help, disgusted by the corporate culture he witnessed. Later that evening, after most employees had left, Marcus entered his true office, a converted maintenance room in the basement. Behind the cleaning supplies and old equipment lay a state-of-the-art command center. Multiple screens displayed feeds from his carefully placed sensors throughout the building. "Computer, display personnel changes last quarter," he commanded. The AI system he personally designed responded instantly, showing alarming patterns of demographic shifts. His phone buzzed, a text from his daughter Maya, a successful attorney. "Dad, you don't have to keep doing this. We can fight them legally now." Marcus smiled sadly. Maya had never understood why he chose this path. But he knew that real change required more than legal battles. It required understanding the depth of the problem from the inside. A notification flashed on his screen. Anderson was accessing restricted files about the company's original AI patents, the ones Marcus had designed. This wasn't the first time the CEO had tried to modify Marcus's original work, attempting to strip away the ethical constraints he'd built into the system. Through his cameras, Marcus watched the nighttime cleaning crew arrive, all people of color, all invisible to the daytime workforce. He'd made sure to create good jobs for them, with full benefits and education assistance, all buried in budget lines that Anderson never bothered to examine. "Mr. Johnson," Michael's voice came through his secure line. "Anderson's scheduled an all-hands meeting for tomorrow. Theme: corporate culture evolution. Marcus felt a familiar weight settle in his chest. He'd watched Richard Anderson systematically dismantle everything Innovatech was meant to be. The company had been founded to create technology that served humanity equally, not to become another tool of systemic oppression. As he prepared to leave for the night, Marcus caught his reflection in the polished elevator doors. The janitor's uniform had become more than a disguise, it was armor, allowing him to move unseen through the corridors of power, gathering evidence, and preparing for the day when he would finally reclaim his company. He thought about the young black software engineer he'd seen crying in the stairwell that morning after another hostile team meeting. About the Hispanic security guard who'd been passed over for promotion 6 times. About the Indian programmers whose ideas were stolen by their managers. Tomorrow would bring another day of careful observation, of gathering evidence, of watching and waiting. But Marcus could feel the momentum building. Soon, very soon, it would be time to emerge from the shadows. As he walked to his modest car in the far corner of the parking lot, he passed Anderson's Tesla, remembering the words his father had told him long ago. Sometimes, son, you have to be invisible to see the truth. But when the time comes to be seen, make sure they never forget what they're looking at. Marcus Johnson had been invisible long enough. The revolution he'd been quietly planning was about to begin. The all-hands meeting was exactly what Marcus had expected, a masterclass in corporate doublespeak. Richard Anderson stood on the auditorium stage, his expensive suit and practiced smile a stark contrast to the growing unease in the room. As we evolve into a premier tech leader, we need to ensure our team reflects the professional standards our clients expect, Anderson announced, his words carefully chosen yet unmistakable in their implication. From his position near the back wall, mop in hand, Marcus watched faces in the crowd. Janet, sitting among the HR team, was taking detailed notes. In the middle section, a group of minority engineers exchanged worried glances. They knew what was coming. After the meeting, Marcus received an encrypted message from Michael: they are starting tomorrow. First wave. 47 employees. 89% minorities. Marcus had anticipated this, but the numbers still made his blood boil. He'd spent the past month preparing, carefully documenting every instance of discrimination. Every biased decision, every passed-over promotion. His basement command center now held enough evidence to sink Anderson 10 times over. That afternoon, he watched through his surveillance system as Sarah Chen, a brilliant young programmer, was called into HR. She'd recently filed a patent for an AI breakthrough, one that Anderson had mysteriously taken credit for in last week's board meeting. Miss Chen, your position has been eliminated due to restructuring, the HR representative said mechanically, reading from a script. But my project, the AI enhancement protocol. Sarah's voice trembled. All intellectual property belongs to Innovatech, came the rehearsed response. Marcus pressed a button on his hidden console, sending an automatic message to Myers' law firm. Within hours, Sarah would receive a mysterious email from a top employment lawyer offering to represent her pro bono. The layoffs continued through the week. Marcus mopped floors and emptied trash bins, bearing witness to the systematic dismantling of diversity within his company. Each night, he added to his growing database of evidence, emails, recordings, performance reviews that showed clear bias. One evening, as he cleaned Anderson's office, he overheard a phone conversation that made him freeze. Yes, Mr. Whitney, the demographic adjustment is proceeding as planned, Anderson was saying. Once we've streamlined the workforce, we can move forward with the AI surveillance contract. Marcus's hands tightened on his mop. Thomas Whitney, the same venture capitalist who'd forced him into hiding 20 years ago. Now it all made sense. The layoffs weren't just about racism. They were preparing to turn Innovatech's AI technology into a surveillance tool, likely targeting minority communities. That night, Marcus called an emergency meeting with his allies in his basement headquarters. They're not just cleaning house, he told Janet and Michael. They're preparing for something bigger. We need to move faster. Janet spread out personnel files across his desk. I've documented 128 cases of discrimination in the past year alone. Wrongful terminations, harassment, stolen patents. And I've got proof of Anderson tampering with the IE's ethical protocols, Michael added. He's trying to remove the fairness constraints you built into the system. Marcus stood before his wall of monitors, each showing different areas of the building he'd built but couldn't openly claim. Start Operation Legacy, he commanded his secure system. Immediately. Encrypted messages went out to key players, employment lawyers, investigative journalists, ethical hackers who owed him favors. Years of preparation were about to pay off. But as he watched another group of shell-shocked employees carrying boxes to their cars, Marcus felt the weight of his choices. How many careers had been damaged while he waited and watched? How many dreams had been crushed while he gathered evidence? A young black IT specialist passed by, head down, carrying his termination papers. Marcus recognized him, James Turner. A promising programmer who'd graduated top of his class from MIT. Mr. Turner, Marcus called out, breaking his usual silence. Don't cash the severance check yet. The young man looked confused, but nodded slowly. He'd understand soon enough. Later that night, Anderson held another executive meeting. Through his surveillance feed, Marcus watched as they celebrated their corporate evolution. By next quarter, we'll have the perfect workforce, Anderson boasted. Clean, corporate, homogeneous. Just like the old days. Marcus had heard enough. He opened his secure laptop and began typing. To the board of directors of Innovatech. The letter he'd been drafting for 20 years was finally ready. In his pocket, he felt the weight of his original company ID card. Preserved from the day he'd founded Innovatech. Soon, very soon, it would see the light again. As he made his final rounds that night, Marcus passed the wall of CEO portraits in the main lobby. Anderson's smug face looked down at him, just like his father's had 20 years ago. But there was an empty space next to it, space for one more picture. Time to clean house, Marcus whispered, allowing himself a small smile. For real this time. The storm he'd been gathering was about to break, and Richard Anderson would never know what hit him. The quarterly board meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m. in the main conference room. By 8:30, Marcus had already cleaned every inch of the space, strategically placing his final surveillance devices. Today, the Invisible Man would finally step into the light. Board members filed in, their Rolex watches glinting under the fluorescent lights. Richard Anderson strode in last, carrying his premium leather briefcase and wearing a smile that suggested victory. Before we begin, Anderson announced, I'm pleased to report that our workforce optimization has exceeded expectations. Our new demographic profile. The door opened. Maya Johnson entered, followed by two senior partners from her law firm. Anderson's smile faltered. Excuse me, this is a private meeting, he began. Actually, Maya said, placing a thick folder on the table. I'm here representing the majority shareholder of Innovatech. The board members stirred uncomfortably. Anderson laughed, there must be some mistake. I know all our major shareholders. Do you? Marcus's voice carried across the room as he entered, still wearing his janitor's uniform. The board members stared, confusion evident on their faces. Security. Anderson called out. Michael Thompson stepped in, but instead of removing Marcus, he stood beside him. No need for that, Mr. Anderson. I answer to the company's founder. Marcus walked to the head of the table, opposite Anderson. 20 years ago, I founded this company with a vision of inclusive technology that would serve all of humanity. When investors wouldn't back a black founder, I was forced to hide. I watched as my company was twisted into everything I fought against. He pulled out his original ID card and a stack of documents. I retain 51% of shares through a complex network of shell companies. I am Marcus Johnson, and I'm taking back my company. The room erupted in chaos. Anderson lunged for his phone, but Janet, who had slipped in quietly, was already distributing USB drives to each board member. You'll find comprehensive evidence of discrimination, patent theft, and ethical violations. Marcus continued calmly. Plus proof of Mr. Anderson's attempt to modify our AI systems for racial profiling. One board member, an elderly woman named Margaret Chen, was already reviewing the files. These numbers, the pattern is undeniable. This is absurd, Anderson sputtered. You expect us to believe our janitor is the secret owner? Marcus smiled, removing his uniform jacket to reveal a crisp suit underneath. Check the patents, Richard. Every major innovation this company was built on. Check the original code. My signature is buried in every line. Maya projected a series of documents onto the screen: incorporation papers, patent filings, stock transfers. My father's ownership is legally ironclad. The board can either vote to remove Mr. Anderson now, or we can take this public. The mood in the room shifted. Board members who had ignored Marcus for years now saw him clearly for the first time. Anderson's face had turned an alarming shade of red. You can't do this, he hissed. The clients, the contracts. Already handled, Marcus replied. I've spent 20 years building relationships with our real clients, not at golf clubs, but in server rooms and IT departments. They know who really built their systems. Margaret Chen stood up. I move for an immediate vote on leadership change. Anderson made one last attempt. Thomas Whitney won't stand for this. Mr. Whitney was arrested this morning, Michael interjected. SEC fraud investigation. Fascinating timing. The vote was swift and decisive. Within an hour, Richard Anderson was escorted from the building, carrying the same kind of cardboard box he'd forced on so many others. As word spread through the building, employees gathered in the atrium. Marcus stood on the stairs, finally visible to all. I owe you an apology, he began. I watched injustice happen in my own company while I gathered evidence. That ends today. Every terminated employee will be offered their job back. Every stolen patent will be credited to its true inventor. And Innovatech will become what it was always meant to be, a company that celebrates diversity of thought, background, and experience. Sarah Chen pushed through the crowd. The AI protocols, you're the one who designed the original ethical framework. Marcus nodded. Technology should unite us, not divide us. That's why I built fairness into the core code that Mr. Anderson tried to corrupt. Reporters had begun gathering outside. The story was already breaking. Tech founder reveals 20-year undercover mission to fight corporate racism. In his old maintenance room office, Marcus met with his core team. Janet was coordinating with HR to contact laid-off employees. Michael was changing security protocols. Maya was handling the press. Was it worth the wait? Maya asked her father softly. Marcus looked at the surveillance screens one last time, screens that had been both his windows and his chains for 2 decades. The truth needed to be undeniable, he replied. Sometimes you have to let people reveal who they really are before you can change things. His phone was flooding with messages, other tech leaders confessing similar experiences. Minority employees sharing stories, investors suddenly interested in diversity initiatives. Tomorrow, he would move into the CEO's office. But tonight, he had one last task. He picked up his mop and headed to Anderson's former office. Dad, you don't have to do that anymore, Maya protested. Marcus smiled. One last clean-up. For old time's sake. As he mopped the floor of the office that would soon be his, he remembered every slight, every dismissal, every time he'd been treated as invisible. But now, as he looked out over the city lights, he knew that his visibility would help others be seen. The revolution wasn't over. It was just beginning. 6 months after the revelation, Innovatech's transformation was in full swing. Marcus Johnson's first act as CEO had been to rehire every employee unjustly terminated, but with back pay and stock options. His second act was more symbolic. He kept his janitor's uniform mounted in a glass case in the lobby, with a plaque that read, "Never judge a person's worth by their position." The morning sun streamed through his office windows as Marcus reviewed the quarterly reports. The numbers told a story that defied conventional corporate wisdom. Diversity hadn't hurt the company, it had catalyzed unprecedented growth. "The Wang contract is confirmed," Janitor announced, entering with a tablet. "They said your personal involvement in the AI ethics framework was the deciding factor." Marcus nodded, remembering the countless nights he'd spent coding while pushing his cleaning cart. "How's the mentorship program going?" "Oversubscribed," Janet smiled. "We have 200 senior tech leaders volunteering to mentor minority students. Sarah Chen's leading the AI division now. And her team is 60% women and minorities." The transformation hadn't been without challenges. Some clients, uncomfortable with the new leadership, had pulled their contracts. But for every lost contract, 3 new ones appeared. Companies eager to prove their commitment to diversity flocked to Innovatech. Drawn by Marcus's story and the company's innovative approach to inclusive technology. In the research lab, formerly restricted to senior, mostly white, engineers, a diverse team was developing an AI system to detect and correct bias in hiring processes. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus, they were building technology to prevent exactly what had happened at Innovatech. "Dad?" Maya appeared at his door. "The documentary crew is here." Marcus straightened his tie, no more janitor's uniform, though he sometimes missed its simplicity. The story of Innovatech's transformation had captured national attention, spawning books, movies, and now a documentary series. "Tell them I'll be right down. Just need to check something first." He opened his secure terminal and reviewed the industry-wide impact reports. Since his revelation, 5 major tech companies had appointed black CEOs. Venture capital firms were scrambling to establish diversity initiatives. 3 former executives, including Richard Anderson, were under federal investigation for discrimination and patent theft. But more importantly, anonymous surveys showed that 78% of minority employees in tech felt more empowered to speak up about discrimination. The Marcus Johnson effect, they called it. In the main atrium, now redesigned with art from diverse global artists, the documentary crew was setting up. James Turner, the young programmer Marcus had stopped from cashing his severance check, was now leading the blockchain division. "Mr. Johnson," James called out, "the MIT students are here for the tour." A group of young, diverse faces looked up at Marcus with a mixture of awe and hope. He remembered being their age, full of ideas but facing closed doors. "Welcome to Innovatech," he began. "Let me tell you a story about invisibility and visibility." The tour moved through the building, but it wasn't just about showing off technology. Marcus pointed out the prayer room installed for Muslim employees, the lactation rooms for new mothers, the gender-neutral bathrooms, the wheelchair-accessible workstations. Technology should adapt to humans, he explained, not the other way around. In the cafeteria, now offering cuisine from around the world, Marcus sat with the students. They peppered him with questions, not just about technology, but about survival, strategy, and change. "How did you bear it?" one young woman asked. "Being invisible for so long?" Marcus considered carefully. "I wasn't invisible, I was watching. Sometimes the best way to change a system is to understand it completely. But," he added firmly, "that doesn't mean the next generation should have to do the same." Later that afternoon, Marcus had a different kind of meeting. Thomas Whitney, now under house arrest, had requested to see him. "You outplayed us all," Whitney admitted, looking older and defeated. "I underestimated you 20 years ago." "You underestimated a lot of people," Marcus replied. "That's the problem with prejudice, it blinds you to potential." Back at Innovatech, the day was ending. Marcus walked the halls, not with a mop this time, but with the same observant eye. He saw engineers of all backgrounds collaborating, heard multiple languages in the corridors, watched as a team ordered dinner for their late-night coding session, making sure to accommodate everyone's dietary restrictions. In his office, he found a gift on his desk. It was a framed copy of the original Innovatech business plan, written in his hand 20 years ago. The final paragraph read, "Technology should unite humanity, not divide it. Innovation comes from diversity of thought, and thought knows no color." His phone buzzed. Another interview request, this time from a global tech conference. They wanted him to keynote on the future of inclusive innovation. Marcus smiled, remembering all the tech conferences he'd watched from the sidelines while cleaning the convention centers. Now he was the speaker everyone wanted to hear. As night fell over Silicon Valley, Marcus stood at his office window. The city lights sparkled, just as they had on countless nights when he'd cleaned this same window. But now he saw something different in their glow, possibility. His computer pinged with a message from Maya, "Dad. The new diversity hiring numbers are in. We're changing the game." Marcus typed back, "No, we're just finally playing it fair." He gathered his things, ready to head home. As he passed the lobby, he nodded to the new janitor who was being paid a living wage with full benefits and stock options, just like every other employee. "Good night, Mr. Johnson," the janitor called out. "Good night, David," Marcus replied, using his name, always using his name. Outside, a group of young tech workers was leaving a nearby startup. They pointed at Marcus, whispering in recognition. He wasn't invisible anymore, but more importantly, his visibility was making others visible too. The revolution wasn't just about one company or one man. It was about changing the narrative of what leadership looks like, what innovation looks like, what success looks like. As Marcus drove home, he passed the spot where he'd parked his cleaning cart for 20 years. The world had changed, and he had helped change it. But there was still work to do. Tomorrow, there would be more meetings, more decisions, more steps toward progress. But tonight, Marcus Johnson, the founder who became a janitor who became a symbol of change, allowed himself to feel something he hadn't felt in 20 years, completely, unequivocally visible.